안녕하세요. Hi everyone. I'm Jake. Thanks for watching. As I mentioned in my previous video, today we're going to talk about markers or particles. If you're learning Korean, you probably know they can be quite confusing. But let me tell you something. As a native Korean speaker, I used to find English articles quite confusing too. Learning a language takes time. So be patient, keep working hard, and you'll eventually get there, right? Now let's get started. As you saw in my previous video, there are two types of markers, subject markers and object markers. Today, we're going to focus on the subject markers, 은는 and 이가. Functionally, 은 and 는 are the same, and 이 and 가 are as well. Then when should we use each one? Here's a simple rule. If the last syllable of a noun ends in a consonant, use 은 or 이. If it ends in a vowel, use 는 or 가. So what's the difference between 은는 and 이가? In Korean grammar, 은는 is classified as a 보조사, auxiliary particle, meaning it can attach not only to a subject, but also to objects, adverbs, and even other particles, while 이가 is classified as a 주격조사, subject case marker, meaning it usually attaches to a subject in a sentence. Functionally, you can think of 은는 as a topic marker and 이가 as a subject marker. Now let's compare these two. Do you remember I mentioned earlier that I used to find English articles quite confusing? So let's first compare Korean markers with English articles. In English, when you introduce new information or mention a subject for the first time, you use the indefinite article or un. Later, if you mention the same subject again, you use the definite article 더. For example, you might say, a man was singing in his car. The man looked happy. In Korean, I would say, 한 남자가 차 안에서 노래하고 있었어요. 그 남자는 행복해 보였어요. As you can see, we use 이가 in a similar way to the indefinite article or un, and 은는 in a similar way to the definite article 더. This rule doesn't always apply perfectly, but it can help you understand 은는 and 이가 more easily, since articles are used so frequently in English. Let's look at one more example. In English, you might say, a student was learning Korean. The student got confused about the use of markers. In Korean, I would say, 한 학생이 한국어를 배우고 있었어요. 그 학생은 조사의 사용이 헷갈렸어요. Here, 이 and 은 are used because the last syllable of the noun ends in a consonant. Okay, next let's talk about why 은는 is called the topic marker and 이가 is called the subject marker. To understand this better, let's think about the following situation, since Korean is very context dependent. Let's say I'm grabbing a beer at a bar and start talking to the person next to me. This person asks, where are you from? 어디에서 왔어요? I reply, I'm from Korea. 저는 한국에서 왔어요. Or, I'm Korean. 저는 한국 사람이에요. Then this person continues asking, What brought you here? 무엇 때문에 여기 왔어요? And I respond, I'm traveling. 저는 여행 중이에요. In this conversation, I am the topic. We're talking about me, so I keep saying 저는. Of course, I'm the subject in these sentences, but the focus is more on where I'm from or what I'm doing here. Therefore, these sentences emphasize the predicate rather than the subject itself. What is a topic in a sentence? It's what we are generally talking about, so 은는 is used when we're discussing something broadly. For example, 한국은 아시아에 있어요. Korea is in Asia. This expresses a general statement or a fact that is always true. So in this case, 은는 is used. Okay, back to the conversation. Let's say another person nearby joins in and asks, Who's from Korea? I reply, I'm from Korea. 제가 한국에서 왔어요. As you can see, I use 제가 because I'm the one who's from Korea. In this case, the focus is more on the subject itself, since the other person already knows one of us is from Korea. That's why we use 이가 when referring to something specific, in this case, the subject I in the sentence. So we use 은는 when something is introduced as a topic, similar to as for or when it comes to in English. We use 이가 when the subject is the one performing the action or being described in the sentence. That's why 은는 is called the topic marker and 이가 is called the subject marker. Also, 이가 is normally used to mark the subject of a sentence, whereas 은는 marks the topic. But 은는 doesn't just mark topics. It can also add emphasis or contrast depending on the context. And it can attach to subjects, objects, adverbs, and other particles as a 보조사, auxiliary particle, while 이가 usually attaches to subjects as a 주격조사, subject case marker. I'm not going to cover all the detailed uses of 은는 today, since that could get a bit confusing. We'll definitely have another chance to go over them later. And there's still more to talk about when it comes to 은는 and 이가. Okay, now let's talk about an important function of 은는 and 이가. 은는 can have a contrastive function, but 이가 does not. Let's go back to our conversation to see this in action. Let's say another person joins the conversation, so now there are four of us. I'll refer to them as person A, B, and C. Now I'm asking where they are from. Person A replies, I'm from the States. 저는 미국에서 왔어요. Or, I'm American. 저는 미국 사람이에요. Person B replies, I'm also from the States. 저도 미국에서 왔어요. Or, I'm also American. 저도 미국 사람이에요. Here, do is another auxiliary particle, which means also. Now, person C replies, I'm from Canada. 저는 캐나다에서 왔어요. Or, I'm Canadian. 저는 캐나다 사람이에요. As you can see, 는 is used here because person C isn't from the States, creating a contrast between person A, B, and C. Now, what if they were all from different countries? Then each person would say, 저는 미국에서 왔어요. I'm from the States. 저는 캐나다에서 왔어요. I'm from Canada. 저는 스페인에서 왔어요. I'm from Spain. In this case, 는 is used in each sentence to highlight the contrast between them. I continue asking what their names are. Person A replies, I'm Bruce. 저는 브루스예요. Person B replies, I'm Kevin. 저는 케빈이에요. Person C replies, I'm Bruno. 저는 브루노예요. Since their names are all different, 는 is used in each sentence to show the contrast between them. Let's cover one more aspect of the contrastive function of 는. As I mentioned earlier, 는 is classified as 보조사, auxiliary particle. This means you can use it after an object in a sentence to add emphasis or contrast depending on the situation. For example, let's say someone asks, 과일 좋아해요? Do you like fruit? I might reply, 저는 사과는 좋아해요. I like apples. Notice that 는 is used after the object 사과. This actually means I don't like fruit in general, but I like apples. In other words, I'm contrasting apples with other types of fruit. Let's look at another example. Someone asks, 스포츠 좋아해요? Do you like sports? I reply, 저는 보는 것은 좋아해요. I like watching sports. Here, the meaning is, I don't like playing sports in general, but I like watching them. Now let's move on to the last point about 는 and 이가. If your Korean is at an intermediate level, you can probably combine different clauses in a sentence. In that case, 는 marks the topic of the whole sentence, while 이가 is used after the subject in the embedded clause. For example, take the sentence, baseball is the sport that I like the most. Notice the relative clause, that I like the most, in this sentence. So in Korean, I would say 야구는 제가 가장 좋아하는 스포츠예요. Here, 야구는 marks the topic of the sentence and 제가 marks the subject within the embedded clause. Let's look at another example. Green is the color that I like the most. 녹색은 제가 가장 좋아하는 색깔이에요. Again, 녹색은 is the topic and 제가 is the subject in the embedded clause. All right, I think that's enough for 는 and 이가 for today. So today we've covered the subject markers 는 and 이가. As I mentioned earlier, there are still more to learn about how to use 는 and 이가, but you'll start to feel more comfortable using them once you get used to the points I explained today. In my next video, we're going to talk about the object markers, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.